Hi, my name is Sam Ireland, and I was selected as the 2022 Matt Hagny No-Till Travel Scholarship recipient. It was a great honor to be selected as a recipient this year, and I'd read many of Matt's papers and the work that he'd done, and heard a lot about him from Dwayne Beck, who was one of my mentors as well. So, uh, the area of interest that I chose to focus on was intercropping, and this practice encompasses growing two or more crops in close proximity at the same point in time. And this has been done by planting mixes or using alternating rows, also been done by using alternating passes with a seeder. My preconceived notions going in were that this practice had some potential to reduce some pest pressure by increasing some of the diversity in our agroecosystems, and we could also potentially increase the productivity of the system. The looming obstacles that I saw as challenges or hurdles for us were herbicide restrictions, crop insurance restrictions, in which an intercrop would not be covered under our crop insurance programs, and also the harvest challenges in which you'd be setting your combine to harvest two or more different sizes of seed and types of seed, and then also separating the seed after harvest. So I started my trip by traveling up into North Dakota, and there was a intercropping field day hosted by Mike Osley, who is the director of the Carrington Research Extension Center. And so it would have been July 27th, 2022 is when I went up there for that. And the first stop was at Lee Farms in Bisbee, North Dakota. And Paul Overby is the producer that works on that farm, and he is a no-till farmer that has been practicing intercropping since 2019. So our first stop was an interesting one. It was a sunflower field in which a pollinator cover crop mix had been planted the same day as the sunflowers. Now, little background information: the area of North Dakota Central, uh, North Dakota, where we were visiting, was extremely wet, and they had been getting hit with rain that we further down in South Dakota had been missing. But they were very wet for the year and actually kept them out of the field early spring. So back to this cover crop, they planted the sunflowers and cover crop mix in separate passes, and the cover crop mix consisted of field pea, cowpea, faba bean, lentils, flax, and the area that no cover crop mix, so there would have been strips with no cover crop mix, they sprayed express, so they had some express flowers that they were able to use that chemical on. And where they had the cover crops growing, it looked like to me that there was a few more weeds, but some of that weed pressure was actually reduced by the cover crop mix, and so the competition of those cover crops underneath the sunflower canopy was reducing some of that weed pressure in lieu of using that herbicide. Our second stop was at a pea canola intercrop, so they refer to it as Piola. And the goal here of the producer was to harvest 125% of the yield goal of 1,800 pounds of canola. So they wanted to do 125% of that with the pea and canola. And again, this cover crop, or this intercrop, I mean, was planted in separate passes, but on the same day. So June 2nd is when this one would have gone in, and Paul Overby expressed to us that he has had the experience that too much nitrogen actually favors the canola over the peas. So that's another consideration here, that it does get tricky with your fertility and back to some of the herbicides. So there's a lot of considerations here in the intercropping. Some of the soil samples that they've taken, they've estimated that the peas leak about 20 pounds of nitrogen to the canola in the mix that they're doing. And this was a easy mix to separate after the fact, but difficult to combine. is what Paul Overby had told us. He said it was difficult to get the combine set to harvest the peas and the canola and keep your tank relatively clean. But afterwards, separation's quite easy because the pea seed is quite a bit larger than the canola. So the next stop on our field day was in Milo, North Dakota, and the grower that we visited there was Nathan Niemeyer. The first stop at his farm that we looked at was a hard red spring wheat field with a cover crop planted. And so the cover crop was planted on a diagonal, and the mix there was a field pea, buckwheat, lentil, radish, crimson clover, and collards. And the plan or objective here was to graze the cover crop after wheat harvest. And so you would have that cover crop established and growing while that wheat is maturing, and then harvest off that wheat, let that cover crop keep going for a little while, and then put cows in there and graze it. And one thing that I never knew and learned while I was up there is that they got to talking about some cattle with white markings sunburning after eating buckwheat. And so there's a photosensitivity in cattle, and the buckwheat contains some photoreactive compounds. And it seemed that this was only the case when buckwheat was eaten in large amounts. And so it wasn't always a concern, but if that buckwheat in the mix was heavy, then it was something to consider. The fourth stop that we hit, also on Nathan Niemeyer's place, was a soybean canola mix. This was planted together, so this was just one pass, which would have been the first of the day, where it was all seeded together. And to me, this field looked like in places it was dominated by soybeans, and other spots canola, and somewhat uneven, which may cause some challenges when combining. It looked like, it's another mix where the soybeans and the canola are pretty different seed size, so the separation aspect is going to be simple compared to getting that into the combine and keeping your tank somewhat clean. And the last stop of the day, we looked at some of their it would have been Nathan Niemeyer's grain separating equipment. And so that wrapped up what I thought to be a very impressive field day. So the next day I traveled to that night actually to Plentywood, Montana, and then crossed the border into Saskatchewan near Minton. And I was planning to visit Derek Axton at Axton Farms that morning. And so we got there pretty early and got to spend the entire day at Axton Farms, which was really the highlight of my trip. It was just a lot of fun visiting with Derek, and he's a very smart guy, and he's got a lot of things going on his operation, a lot of different facets to that operation, and really could have stayed a week and still had plenty to learn there. But he's got lots of experience in the interseeding, but he's actually backing off from it some, and I don't think it's because he's discouraged by it. He's more so just taking on more work. He just bought an additional 5,000 acres, so he's getting more land, and he's the management of his system is increasing. So I think this is an important point to make too. Interseeding demands some intensive management, and so sometimes it's multiple passes that you have to make, and then you got to separate your seed unless you're going for feed afterwards. So there's just a lot of considerations here. So if acreage is a limitation and you're looking to increase your production, that could be a very good fit there. Derek also works with his brother-in-law who lives nearby and runs cattle, so that gives him some flexibility with the intercropping. And he was one intercropping mix that we looked at was winter peas with mustard. And so the winter peas, they would be flat otherwise, but they use their tendrils to climb up on that mustard and keep them vertical and keep that vertical architecture. So that was kind of interesting. Derek likes to use his 1890 John Deere, the double shoot air drill, disc drill there to do his interseeding. He can meter 2 separate products. He also has a Spider no-till disc drill, which is made by K-Hart, which I'm pretty impressed with their openers. I think they got a good bearing in there, and Derek and I took a pretty close look at that drill while I was up there as well. The rest of the day we spent a lot of time just visiting about what all he had going on his operation. He's got a seed cleaning plant and he's starting to produce his own flour. We took a look at some of their equipment on his combine. He runs a chaff deck on the combine, which drops the heavier chaff weed seeds into their controlled farming areas. And he also runs his tires backwards on his combine, which we see often on carts. And the idea is to not push the soil out, but it could increase your slippage. And Derek, when I asked him why he went through the work to do that, he said, well, mostly it's a good conversation piece. So he had some good humor there as well. He showed me he runs a water tank on his grain cart, which I'd heard of and seen before, but then I know they make kits to do this. And he got to tell me the story of a couple years earlier. They had a fire in a field, and the starter cord on their water tank broke when they tried to start it. So it kind of proved useless. So they hooked that directly to their hydraulics, and just something that I think makes a lot of sense too. And a crazy thing that was going on while I was up there, phenomenon, they had a grasshopper infestation that was unlike they'd seen in quite some time. And there were planes just spraying everywhere. And these grasshoppers were thick on the roads, and to the point where they were even getting tires wet. So that was crazy to see. So that afternoon, after I got done visiting with Derek, I headed to Redvers, Saskatchewan, where I met with Lena Shaw, who's the research manager for the Southeast Research Farm. And I would venture to say they're doing as much interseeding research and plots as anyone that I'm aware of. And they have so many plots, hundreds of plots going on each year of different mixes that they're looking at and studying. And so I had actually visited the day after their field day. So everything was set up for field day, and I was able to get a personal tour and really just ask a lot of questions. So that was pretty neat. The first stop that we took a look at was some 60-inch corn work that they're doing. And I thought 60-inch corn we wouldn't be seeing up in Redvers, Saskatchewan, but we got to the field and I had asked Lena what the relative maturity of the corn was, and she told me, well, we go by corn heat units. And so I took a picture of their sign. I had no idea what a translation was of the corn heat unit, so I got that back and found out it was 81-day relative maturity, what we would call in the US. So that's what they were working with, and the idea was to use this for a forage. And so they would plant their cover crops or their intercrops in between, and then harvest it as a forage, and seemed to be a popular practice actually in that area. And they would plant their cover crops in their corn crop when that corn was about the 5 to 6 leaf stage. And so, as I mentioned, they're doing about as much intercropping work and plots as anyone I'm aware of, and they're looking at peas, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, flax, canola, mustard, carinata, soybeans, corn, cereal grains, just everything, every possible combination you could imagine. They are trying it. So that was pretty impressive to see. In summary, this trip, I learned that I think there's real potential for this practice to improve some productivity and to reduce some pest pressure by increasing the diversity of your system, especially in situations where acreage is a limitation, and with increasing land prices and reduced land availability, that may be a solution to improve some productivity. The management intensity does increase. It becomes a more management intensive system, and there's more considerations, possibly additional passes, some obstacles in combining, and then you have your seed separation. So there's more to consider. The Matt Hagny no-till travel scholarship was just a tremendous learning experience for me, and I'd like to thank the Scholarship Foundation for giving me this opportunity, and I'd like to encourage others that are considering applying for this opportunity to do so and to take full advantage of it.